Okay, everyone, let's get started. I'm Jason Jordan. I'm a partner with Vantage Point Performance. Let me introduce my partner here, Michelle Vazana. Michelle is the CEO and also a founding partner of our company, Vantage Point. She is co-author of our book, Cracking the Sales Management Code, and the lead author in her new book, which is called Crushing Quota. And so Michelle is going to be sharing some of the new research that's in that book. The book should be shipping at the end of the month, which I guess it is. So, if what you see entices you, then I encourage you to go to Amazon or your favorite outlet and order that book. It's really quite wonderful. So with that, Michelle, let me turn it over to you and let you share your insights.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jason. Welcome, everyone. So glad you joined us today. I've got a lot of exciting things to share with you. But before we get into the meat of the presentation, I would be remiss if I didn't talk just a little bit about Vantage Point and who we are as a company. So one of the things that you know, if you have paid attention to us as a firm, is that we are very steeped in research. We are prolific researchers, and everything we do as a company is based on solid and extensive research studies. We also use that research to help our clients more effectively focus on sales execution. We would go so far as saying that at Vantage Point, we speak frontline. We don't just speak sales execution, but we speak frontline. So what can you expect out of today's webcast, and how does it relate to the series of webcasts that we're going to be doing around this most recent research? Let's take a look. So this is the first in a three-part series of webinars that stem from the research that went into our book, Crushing Quota. The reason it's a three-part series is because there's three primary sections within the book, and each webinar will address one of the sections. So what you can expect in today's webcast, we're going to talk about the business case for sales coaching, what we uncovered in our research, what our approach to research was, how do we go about asking questions and getting really insightful answers? What are some of those findings and implications for sales managers and the organizations that employ them? We'll take a look at some barriers to coaching, how coaching most directly impacts quota, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how enablement efforts sometimes go awry. Now, we've gotten a lot of inquiries from you over the last few days. Thank you so much about things that you would like to see in this webinar. And I can tell you that if you don't get your questions addressed in this webinar, there's a very good chance that you'll get your questions addressed in one of the next two. So today's is really all about what keeps managers from coaching. The next webinar in the series is all about the framework and approach that high performers use to establish a coaching culture and engage in effective coaching. And the final in the series will get into the details of coaching to activities in the variety of types of activities that managers can coach. So we're going to start broad, and we're going to get more and more specific as these three webinars unfold. So since we are passionate about sales execution, I thought it would really be helpful to begin to examine why execution doesn't happen the way many organizations hope that it will, and why they still struggle to hit their numbers. So if you're a sales leader and you're attending this webinar today, one thing is for sure. If you succeed in hitting your number or your target, you're going to get a bigger target the following year. And this is going to happen quarter after quarter, year after year. And this is happening at the same time that the percentage of salespeople achieving quota is in a steady decline. And organizations are concerned about this, and they do many things to close these gaps. One of the things they do is heavy analytics. They really dive deep into which levers need to move and by how much in order to achieve revenue targets. They make big investments in tools such as Salesforce and SAP to help salespeople become more organized and have greater insight into their pipelines and into their customer base. They even institute formalized sales processes and purchase training to equip their salespeople and sales managers to better execute. And even though all of these investments are significant, our recent research study found that only 52% of the sellers in our study were achieving quota. And this decline in quota attainment is really worrisome, and organizations have not cracked the code on how to turn that around. And one of the primary reasons we find for this disconnect between increasing targets and decreasing numbers of sellers at quota is this assumption that this person who's sort of in the middle of all this, the sales manager, will intuitively know how to utilize all of these disparate tools and processes synergistically in order to increase the percentage of sellers at quota. And it isn't happening. So what do we do about this? Well, first of all, if you're on this webinar, you probably already know that sales managers and the sales management position is an extremely important role in all sales forces. And we also know that one of the most high impact things sales managers can do is coach their salespeople effectively. When we've done research with the Sales Management Association about sales manager training, sales coaching emerges as the top priority as it relates to training that they want to provide for their sales managers. And we also know through our work with the Sales Management Association that when organizations invest in training their sales managers, they get returns. And the more they invest, the greater those returns. So organizations that allocate less than 25% of their total sales training budget to sales managers tend to hover right about goal. Those that invest between 25 and 50% of their budget on sales managers outperform others by about 6%. And as that percentage increases, so does performance. Those organizations that allocate greater than 50% of their training budget to sales managers outperform others by a lot, by 15 percentage points. So we've got some evidence that would suggest that training sales managers matters. And many organizations do this. Many organizations train their sales managers. We're going to talk a little bit more about how they do it a little bit later in the broadcast. So managers matter, coaching matters, training sales managers matter, and yet we've just done this extensive study where we found that 75% of the managers in our study had fewer than 49% of their sellers at quota. So the question you have to be asking if you're paying attention is, what's up? Why are so many managers failing and struggling to get, even half of their sales teams to quota? And this is a question that we have a lot of passion around exploring and have done extensive research to really dig into. So I'm going to share with you a couple of studies that we've done, two specific studies into sales coaching that will shed a lot of light on this disconnect between organizational targets and organizational performance. The first study, a very comprehensive study. This was actually a study where we actually inquired with salespeople, over 400 of them, to find out what types of coaching are you receiving and what is the impact of that coaching on objective quota attainment. Now, clearly it was a little more complicated than this, but we wanted to net it out for you. And we examined, we did a thorough study of the current literature around coaching and the impact on sales performance. And the three most common types of coaching that were examined were coaching to capabilities, coaching to activities, and coaching to outcomes. And we're going to define these in more detail in just a few moments. But the first study examined these three types of coaching very deeply and examined the impact on salesperson performance. And this was a salesperson study. The next study examined in a very granular level of detail the coaching practices that managers engaged in and the impact of those coaching practices on salesperson performance. And we also took a look at the formality of sales processes in place. We looked at sales role characteristics, what was the nature of the roles being managed, and we also took into consideration sales manager demographics. And this was over 1,000 managers, global audience, and this took about 3 years for us to complete this study. So all of the findings that we're going to share today and in the future webcasts, or the most of the findings that we're going to share are directly resulting from these studies that I've just reviewed with you. So as you might expect, sales managers really are the key to sales performance. And what we found is that the top 25% of managers in our study exceeded the revenue targets by 15%. The lowest performers, the bottom 25%, fell short by 24%. And when we actually did the hard math, and we took the average reporting ratios and quotas, the top performing managers generated on average $3.5 million more per manager than their lower performing peers. Now, these are not just guesstimates or estimates. This is hard math, and it's alarming. And when we've shared these statistics with our clients in the past, they have been alarmed by these because inability to get more salespeople to quota is one of the biggest issues organizations are trying to solve in improving performance. So when we took a look at the differences between the top performers, the average performers, and the bottom performers, we looked at this through a few different lenses, and we learned really interesting insights by looking at this in a variety of ways. When we took a look at revenue performance, the picture doesn't look so bad. So the bottom 25% of sales managers were achieving about 76% of their revenue target. The middle 50, which often are called the core, were hovering right around 99% of revenue, of hitting their revenue target. And of course, the top 25% exceeded their revenue targets. So you might be thinking, well, this really isn't such bad news because 75% of the managers in the study are either very close to or exceeding their revenue targets. But if you look at it differently, some additional insight begins to emerge that isn't quite so rosy. When you take a look at another metric that organizations are paying attention to, one that is a little bit more telling is the percentage of sellers at quota. So revenue matters, percentage of sellers at quota also matter and are strong contributors to revenue performance. So when we took a look at the difference in the percentage of sellers at quota between the bottom 25% and the middle 50%, it was negligible. And then you look at the huge leap from the middle performers, the core performers, and the top performers, and the top performers are getting over 30% more of their sellers to quota. And what they're doing in order to get more sellers to quota is not intuitively obvious. As a matter of fact, we're gonna debunk a couple of myths that you may be holding dear during this broadcast today. So if we think about how organizations are attending to sales execution and sales managers in particular, what we see is that the view from the top looks pretty rosy, right? Looks pretty good because organizations are doing all of these things to equip their sales force. They're getting tools, they're doing heavy analytics, they're formalizing sales processes, and they're thinking, you know, we've done a lot to equip our managers to succeed and to ensure effective execution on the front line. But then there's the reality of what this looks like from the sales manager's perspective. And the sales manager's reality is really kind of scary. And why is that? Well, there's a host of pressures that are being exerted on sales managers that are unrelenting. The most dominant force or pressure on the sales manager is sales leadership. You know, demanding the forecast, demanding updates to the pipeline, demanding deals be closed to hit the monthly number. And that is unrelenting. We've got HR, who is really riding herd on sales managers to coach and train and assess their sellers against competency models and develop plans for developing their sellers. We've got sales operations wanting to get higher adoption rates of the CRM and information for reporting purposes. And then we've got marketing. They've got campaigns. They've got customers they're targeting. They've got new products that need to be sold. And managers are sort of that conduit between marketing and the salespeople. We've got customers. Customers have their own sets of demands, right? They have issues, they have problems they need resolved. And then, of course, last but not least, we've got our sales team, right? Salespeople need help. They need development. They need help making more sales. They need help putting together proposals, going on sales calls. So when you think about all of the stresses and pressures that are being exerted on a sales manager, it's really no wonder that more effective coaching isn't happening. We really shouldn't be that surprised when we look at the chaos that surrounds a sales manager on a daily basis, that they're struggling to develop their teams, they're struggling to coach, they're struggling to get more of their salespeople to quota. And I wanted to share one more piece of research that we did not conduct, but it's an interesting and relevant piece of research. A gentleman named Adam Rapp, who is at the Ohio University Sales School, he's the executive director at the sales school. He and a few of his colleagues did a time study on how sales managers spend their time. And you can see, what the breakdown is between managing people, managing information, customer interaction, and administrative tasks. And I think what's most scary about this, this study and the findings from this study are that best case managers really only have about 32% of their time to manage their salespeople. And that is all of the things that are involved in managing their salespeople, including coaching, including setting direction, including joint sales calls. I mean, imagine that coaching is only a small subset of this 32% of time that managers have to allocate to managing their team. And it becomes even more scary. And we become a little more open to understanding why the job of sales manager is such a hard one, and why they struggle so mightily to coach, even when they know how. So we're going to actually do a poll. We'd like to make this a little bit more interesting and engaging for our audience. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Jason. And what I want you to first, the poll is basically going to ask you whether you believe that successful sales managers spend more time than less successful sales managers coaching each seller on their team.
So it looks like 65% of the people thought that's a true statement, and 35% of the folks said that that is a false statement. And we had over 80% of the attendees voting, so pretty fair number of votes.
Oh, good. So thank you so much for responding. So let's take a look at what the research shows. Do the most successful sales managers spend more time coaching each seller? And survey says no. We were shocked by this finding. We fully anticipated, just like many of you on this webcast, that there would be a direct positive correlation between time spent coaching and revenue performance and quota attainment. And what we found was just the opposite. As a matter of fact, the bottom performing managers on average spent 24.2 hours per month coaching their members of their team, versus the top 25% who on average reported coaching 17.7 hours. Now, you have read, if you're on this webinar, you've read lots of research studies and you're trying to make sense of it all. And a lot of studies will say the sweet spot is between 3 and 5 hours per seller. That's what the SEC says. They've got some more recent research that says it's 8 hours per seller. And you can read other studies that basically it's all over the board. But the prevailing wisdom is that more coaching equals better performance. And we did not find that to be true. And you're probably scratching your head right now thinking, well, oh my God, how can this not be true? How can coaching for fewer hours lead to better performance? And we're going to talk more specifically about that in webinars 2 and 3. So the next point that I want to share in our research is really about the different types of coaching that we examined. Remember, we said in the first study, we examined 3 very specific types of coaching and the impact on performance. The first type of coaching we examined was what we would call capability coaching. Well, we don't call it that. That's what it's called in the literature. And capability coaching is really about developing seller skills and knowledge. The other type of very predominant coaching that's in the literature is outcome coaching, which is assessing sellers against targets. So it could be revenue, it could be units sold, it could be market share. And the final type of coaching is about activities, and that's really about influencing seller actions and behaviors. So these types of coaching probably look very familiar to you. You've probably seen one or all of these either being deployed in your organization or you've been trained on these types of coaching. And we'd like to get your opinion. So we're going to do another quick poll. And we would like for you to give us your feedback on which of these three types of coaching, capability coaching, outcome coaching, or activity coaching, are most strongly correlated with quota attainment.
So 69% said activity coaching, 12% said outcome coaching, and 20% said capability coaching. So activity coaching was a solid winner here.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good. Okay, thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for responding. So let's take a look at the impact of these different types of coaching on quota attainment. So capability coaching, on focusing on skills and knowledge, 2% of the variance in quota attainment, only 2% was attributed to coaching to capabilities. 10% of the variance was attributed to coaching to outcomes. And a full 24% of the variance in quota attainment was coaching to activities. Now, what's interesting is that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a few minutes, but there's a lot of buzz in the industry and training and models that are primarily oriented toward capabilities, and we'll talk about what those are in just a few minutes. But what I'd like to share with you next, and I'd like to remind you about, is when we did this research with the Sales Management Association, sales coaching was the #1 topic for training. So let's take a look at how organizations typically train their sales managers to coach and how that relates to our research findings. So what we find, and we have worked with hundreds of organizations over the last 9 years to help enable their sales managers to coach. And we always ask questions and do some examination of the types of coaching training that they've already provided. And there's a lot of general leadership training that organizations provide to their sales managers. And as a matter of fact, they provide it to any of their first line leaders, whether they're in sales or any other function. And the two that crop up the most are the GROW model and situational leadership. So these are very powerful coaching models, really designed to drive good interpersonal conversations, but heavily oriented around seller capabilities. And then there's competency models. Organizations spend thousands and thousands of dollars developing sophisticated competency models. They assess their salespeople and sales managers against these models, and they expect managers to coach to close these competency gaps. And again, these are all aimed solidly at the lowest performing type of coaching in our study. Well, that's not really good news. So what about coaching to outcomes? How do organizations coach to outcomes? Well, when we think about outcome coaching and we examine most formalized cadences or rhythms and pipeline coaching and forecasting practices within the organizations within which we work, those types of practices and formalization are all aligned with coaching to outcomes. So, and we would say not only are they coaching to outcomes, but we would say it's not really coaching at all. We would say that it's inspection disguised as coaching. And in our study of sales coaching practices, we saw a direct negative correlation between using formalized coaching sessions to focus on inspection and salesperson performance. So the lowest performers were much more likely to spend dedicated coaching time focused on outcomes as compared to top performers. And the difference between the bottom 25 and the middle is negligible. But you can see there's a huge drop in the percentage of sales managers that are high performers that use dedicated scheduled coaching time to focus on outcomes. So that leaves really, what we would call leads to the biggest disconnect between the way we enable sales managers and our ability to hit quota. A lot of the formalized coaching training and formalized management rhythms and cadences are either aligned to activity or aligned to capabilities or outcomes. and the most important type of coaching is coaching to activities. So we would call this idea and practice of coaching to activities the last frontier in coaching, and it's the most important frontier in coaching. So how do organizations get it wrong? Because organizations do absolutely train their managers on how to coach to activities. But the way they do this often just creates more confusion and complexity than it solves. So I'm not going to pick on any one training company, but I'm going to highlight an example based on one of the largest training companies in existence that it's been around the longest. And I'm going to align the example to 3 different types of activity coaching. So in our research that went into cracking the sales management code and is also detailed very heavily in Crushing QUOTA, we actually had 4 types of seller activities that can be coached: territory management, account management, opportunity management, and call management. And the ones that are most likely to be outsourced from a training perspective are account management, opportunity management, and call management, which is why I chose these 3 for this example. So remember, we talked about the sales manager that is overstressed, overpressured. They have an abundance of tools, they have systems, they've got formal processes. And now we're going to dive into some of those formal processes and how they get trained on them and how it impacts coaching. So let's take a look at 3 different training programs that are designed to formalize these different types of activities. So managing accounts, Miller Heiman has their large account management process. They also have an associated tool called the Gold Sheet that goes along with that. Very popular training program. We also have strategic selling, which is a very robust program designed to help salespeople and sales managers more effectively pursue individual opportunities. And we also have an associated blue sheet to go along with that. And finally, we have conceptual selling, which is designed to help sellers better plan for and conduct individual sales calls and sales conversations. And then we have an associated planning tool with that. So managers typically go through this training along with their salespeople. 3 very robust programs, and many organizations get all of these and maybe even some more. So we've got 3 different programs to address 3 different types of sales activities, but that's really not the scariest part. The scariest part is each of these have an additional coaching program along with it. So if I'm in a large organization and I've gone through the large account management process with my salespeople, I also get some extra training on how to coach to that. And then I get some extra training on how to coach to opportunities, and I get some extra training on how to coach to individual calls, and then I get additional coaching tools to help me with all these 3 types of coaching. Now, this may not seem horribly problematic, but when you layer this onto the other ways that sales managers have been enabled to coach, you get a picture for why sales managers are pulling their hair out. So here we have all of the pressures being exerted on the sales manager from sales leaders, HR, sales ops, marketing, customers, and sales reps. You've got the CRM they have to contend with. You've got all of the dashboards that they have to pay attention to. You've got the 2 leadership models, situational leadership and the GROW model. And now you've got 3 additional ways to coach to layer onto all of that. And managers struggle to make sense of all this. We've even had one of the sales managers in one of our engagements say, "Oh my God, I felt like for years my organization just keeps giving me a bunch of individual ingredients, one after another, when all I wanted was the recipe.